Don't study law, Jefferson.
Hello, I'm Davia Brown.
I'm Brandon Lyles.
And I'm Stacy Loveland, and we're excited to have you join us for Colonial Williamsburg's CW Kids Ask,
Where we dive deep into history.
Together, we'll explore 18th century life and connect it to present day experiences.
We'll look at everything from fashion to science
And economy to archaeology. We'll take a closer look at our past and present.
Join us each month on our live streams and submit your own questions.
or watch past episodes and start your own conversations
The past has something for everyone.
So come join us.
as we discover the past. What are American Indian people's lives like? Hello everyone! Thank you all for joining us today for our very first episode of CW Kids Ask. This is our monthly live stream just for the students, where we will explore 18th century life and learn about the people, events, and ideas that help shape America. Each month we will bust some myths and misconceptions, explore primary sources, and answer questions that you all send to us in the chat. I'm Stacy Loveland, and today we're going to answer the question, what are American Indian people's lives like? Joining me are interpreters from Colonial Williamsburg's American Indian Initiative, Martin Saniga, Chris Costello, and Cody Grant. Let's get started by having you tell us a bit about yourselves.
Hello everybody, my name is Cody Grant. I've been working with the foundation for a number of years. I believe it's going on about 7 years as a full-time staff member. But before I did that, right, I was working with Williamsburg on and off during the spring and the fall for a good long while. I'm originally from Albuquerque, New Mexico, so my mother's community is the tribe that I'm enrolled in, which is the Pueblo Visleta. But I moved to Virginia from my father's community, which is the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Chris Costello. I'm Cherokee. I spent most of my life traveling to different areas, so I spent a lot of time with the Osage in Oklahoma, tribes up in Alaska, the Inupiaq, the Tlingit, the Haida, and now I'm here in Virginia, spending a lot of time with the local tribes here. So you got the Chickahominys and Pamunkeys and Mattapanais, Upper Mattapani, Nansmen, just to name a few of those tribes. So yeah, I'm here in Virginia now, and I'm also the newest member of the American Indian Initiative here at Colonial Williamsburg.
Yeah, I'm Martin. So I grew up about 30 minutes from here, but I'm supporting from the High Plains community in Person County, North Carolina. I'm the supervisor of the initiative, but spent most of my life in and around Virginia. So the Virginia Indian community is kind of where I consider my home. Aside from that, I lived up in Massachusetts and hung out with some Wampanoags for a while. And before coming and working here at Colonial Williamsburg, I was working up at the National Museum of the American Indian in D.C.
Wonderful. I'm thrilled you're all here with us today. I think we're going to have a great conversation. As you watch, do feel free to send in your questions. But to get us started off, let's talk about language. Some people say American Indian, some say Native American, some say Indigenous. Which one do you all prefer?
That's a good question. So when you think about the terms American Indian, Native American, up in Canada, a lot of folks will use the term First Nations, right, or Indigenous. None of those terms are more correct than any other. And that's simply to the idea that saying American Indian or Native American is like saying European or African, because it doesn't denote any specific culture or region or group of people. So here all throughout the Americas, you're going to find different people who identify themselves in different ways. So it's really neat to see the variety of the way people will mention themselves. So separate of just those larger ideas, you will see people say, I am from this tribe, or I'm a member of this particular nation instead. What do y'all think?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it kind of echoing what Cody said, it doesn't really matter. All of those terms, Indigenous, First Nations, American Indian, Native American, they're all language of colonization. They're never how we would have referred to ourselves historically. But when you look at like Virginia, for example, the tribes here in Virginia, they prefer the term Indian. That's how they want to be referred to as collectively. But for me, it doesn't much matter, right? For me, it's more about the context in which you're using them. So for us as Native people who work in museums and who are Native people every day outside of work, there's a difference between someone who's using a term because they think it's the right term and they're trying to be polite versus someone who's using a term because they think it's going to get some sort of rise or reaction out of you. So as long as you're coming with a polite and respectful manner, it doesn't matter to me which type of term you're using.
Well, mentioning that there are people who are sometimes trying to get a rise out of individuals, what kind of prejudices exist today for American Indian people?
So some people face things like state-recognized tribes who may not have that federal recognition. They have issues kind of getting a hold of federal government to, have their voices heard, or they have a low population, though a high percentage of that population might have an issue. That number is just so low that the voice doesn't seem as loud as it should be.
Yeah, echoing what Chris says, that smaller population, right? As Native people, we make up less than 2% of population. That's down from 1.100% of the population here in the United States and throughout North and South America. Typically, we're not determining who gets elected to state or national elections, and so things that are issues to us, the DAPL pipeline, the Line 3, missing and murdered Indigenous women, those things don't necessarily take a huge precedent because our voice as Native people collectively isn't very large politically.
I really caught on one of the statistics you just gave us saying population's down to 2% originally from 100%, which I think a lot of people probably haven't considered before. So how did the arrival of Europeans affect tribes?
So I think the biggest one is going to be population, right? So North and South America, all of the people originally here in North and South America are indigenous. They are Native people, regardless of how we view them through political borders today. In the first 100 years of contact, before really most folks had ever seen someone from Europe, European diseases begin to spread through our community. And so in the first 100 years, 94 to 96% of the populations of North and South America are heavily decimated. On the low end, possibly only 150 million. On the high end, close to 400 million folks are gone because of the spread of that disease. So that's obviously a huge, clear impact. The other one is with the influence of European goods. So prior to European arrival, a lot of what we produce is for ourselves. So if you need textiles, you're harvesting those plant materials, you're processing them, you're making the textiles, you're farming your own fields, you're hunting your own meats, or doing it communally for your town or maybe your extended family. But with the influx of Europeans, you now have ready-made goods. You can go and trade for wool cloth, ready-made shirts and petticoats and waistcoats and jackets and those type of things. Ready-made metal tools, cooking implements, even food. Bring in salted beef and pork, things like that didn't exist to us, and also the animals that comes from, so horses and cows and pigs and chickens. So Europeans are going to have a huge influence and disruption in Native communities historically with their arrival.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, speaking of clothing, today you're all dressed in your own clothes, but when you're interpreting in the American Indian encampment, you're dressed completely differently. And we have a video to show you that talks more about Native clothing.
So when we think about what American Indian people are wearing in the 18th century, sometimes we have the thought to go to leather, fur, and feathers. But actually, with the introduction of European trade, a lot of what we're wearing are things like wool, silk ribbons, cotton, linen. So if you look at much of what I'm wearing, there's very little natural materials that you would see indigenous here to the Americas. And one thing you saw me put on is going to be shoes, for example. While more often than not, a lot of American Indian folks are preferring to wear moccasins while abstaining from shoes. But here and there, you do see some American Indian people choosing to wear things like buckled shoes as well. Mm-hmm.
Our clothing has a very particular look, right? Something like our leggings. It has a very specific cultural significance. So we do not cover the thighs. It is considered feminine. And it also is to display things like tattoos, which traditionally would have been shown here to show records of warfare, hunting, and things like that.
Our costume pieces come from
combination of sources. So when we start here, CDC, which is our costume design center, issues us out a full allotment of clothing. So trade shirts, leggings, breech clouts, bags, garters, all sorts of different things that they have as a part of their inventory. As the American Indian Initiative, we have purchased items ourselves, so our bags, our leg garters, most of the silver that you see us wearing comes from our department. And some of us create our own clothes. So our leggings, so my leggings, my breech clout, my moccasins, those were all sewn by me. So I purchased the wool, I picked the silk ribbon, the glass beads, and the leather for the moccasins was from here, but everything else is stuff that I purchased to actually put those together. So for us, it's a combination. CDC gives us all the stuff we need, but some of us do prefer to sit and sew our own stuff, whether that's shirts or do some of our own weaving for heddle woven stuff and things like that. So it is a combination of things that is produced by us over at our Costume Design Center, and then also either acquired by the American Indian Initiative itself or produced by myself and the other staff members here for our kind of own enjoyment.
The match coat that I'm wearing seems to be a very important type of clothing that a lot of people are carrying with them in the 18th century for multiple uses. So this can serve as a blanket, something to sit on, but it's also an article of clothing that folks are wearing when going to important functions to that extent. And so it was usually said for Cherokee folks, for instance, that even in the dead of summer, they wouldn't be caught dead without a match coat, right? Bags, the type that I have right here is a heddle woven style of bag. And this is a type of artwork that is introduced with European arrival as well as the materials, right? So with the wool yarn and the glass beads, but this is something that becomes very popular with a lot of southeastern tribes. So when we think about what you could identify coming from certain areas of the Americas, things like heddle weaving and like this, you can kind of point to being indicative of the southeastern United States. Mm-hmm.
The bag I'm wearing is a little different than the one you saw Cody wearing. I do have a heddle woven bag like what Cody had, but I've also got a finger woven bag here. Finger weaving is part of our original textile production. And so once Europeans get here, we stop producing the textiles themselves, whether it's dogbane, stinging nettle, milkweed. We begin using European wools because they come ready-made and pre-dyed. So it's taking that tradition of textile production, using new materials, and that's really all that's left of our textile production. That, and then garters and straps. Everything else has been replaced by ready-made wool and linen and silk.
These armbands are made out of silver. And prior to them being made out of silver, they would be made out of various other items like woven materials, plant materials, copper, and things like that. So these items, we actually wore these prior to the English being here, but upon having access to silver, it is a type of material that we prefer. The gorget is a very particular item to the native culture. So some were made out of bone, stone, shells, and things like that, attached with leather. And actually, it is probably my favorite piece due to the fact that something very similar is happening in English society. When they were knights, they had a big suit of metal armor, and with the introduction of guns, that armor was no longer needed, but they still needed a way to represent their knighthood. So they kept the neck piece, which turned into this gorget here, and that protected the neck, and this becomes more of a status symbol for the English. So it's a very particular item that both cultures are having at the exact same time in two parts of the world.
So my favorite piece of costume is my moccasins. They are gaudy, to say the least, and I absolutely love them. I adore just how flashy they are and how different they are from really anyone else's shoes here in the city. You know, you're not going to mistake my feet for anybody else's as you're walking around town. Getting into costume is I think, getting into character. Even though we don't play specific people, all of our programming is in third person, I think our clothing really helps to spark conversation. There is no one else in Williamsburg that is dressing like us.
And so when folks see us, whether we're out on the street, whether we're at the palace or at our stage shows or at our encampment, our clothing draws people in because they have no context for it. And so they want an answer. Why do we have no pants? Or why are we dressed half in what is perceived as native fashion, half as in European? So it is really a good, solid spark for conversation with our visitors and guests.
Getting into costume makes me feel very unique every day. We have a lot of items that we have to choose from in our allotment, so we can change the way that we look every single day because we do have visitors that visit here regularly, more than just the one day. They come and visit several days in succession. So when they come see us in multiple days, they can see us in various different outfits, with a hat, without a hat, different silver items, different types of shoes and moccasins.
It makes me feel very confident when I get into these clothes. So when you're talking about getting into clothes like this to interpret a lot of the people of the past, it kind of gets you in that mood and that character to talk about the histories that are going on. And so I assume for many of the folks in the historical period, they're wearing their best when they come to places like Williamsburg. And so I kind of feel like I'm dressed as best as I can be for the job.
Welcome back. We are happy to have Mrs. Wise's class from South Carolina joining us today. Thanks so much for tuning in. Everyone else, please keep sending us your questions. But for now, Martin, is there anything else you want to add about clothing?
Yeah, so like I said in that video, my moccasins are probably my favorite piece that I've got. They're based on an original pair from our collection. And as a foundation, we actually collected them from the family that picked them up from somewhere in between like Rhode Island and South Carolina in 1775. They're an interesting pair of moccasins mainly because of the oddity of them. So we see the silk ribbon on the flaps, which is common in the Southeast. Then we see the seams in the front and the back are covered with metallic tape. To my knowledge, this is the only set of moccasins that are decorated like this. Also, there's no indication that these were ever worn. So there's a couple different theories on who or why they may have been created. Some folks say that they're probably not even native made, that they may have been made for the curiosities trade. Wealthy Europeans in this time period are purchasing or getting Indian clothes, bringing them back to Europe, dressing themselves up in them, and having portraits painted. So that may have been what those were.
Interesting. Well, I'm really glad we're able to have those moccasins in our collection, have the photos. Since they were made in the 18th century, they are a primary source that helps us know more about what Native people wore. We have another wearable primary source, actually, a pair of trade silver wristbands. Tell us more about those.
So these trade silver cuffs that you're seeing here are here in the Colonial Williamsburg collection. And it is believed that they actually started out as armbands. As you'll notice that there's an engraving on one and not the other. And that's because it was believed to be a larger armband that was cut down into wrist cuffs.
That's incredible that we get to see those too still. We have some great questions coming in right now. Ezra is asking, what is the Cherokee word for hello?
Oh, well, Shio, Ezra. There's your answer. Yeah, so a simple way to learn how to say hello is just like S-H-I-O, Shio, right? And that's how you pretty much just say hi.
I almost feel bad we didn't start the program by saying that today. Wonderful. Well, Juliana is asking, do the three gentlemen's names have special meaning? So, you guys.
Mine, no. So my name's just Cody Grant. My middle name is Whistler, and my dad gave me the name Whistler because when I was a baby, I used to cry a lot. So every time he whistles, he get me to go to sleep and quit crying.
Mine doesn't have any kind of particular meaning, right? It's just Chris Costello. The Costello name, though, I got from my wife, actually. I took her last name just because it's an important name in her family, and it was important to see my children have that name as well.
Yeah, so Martin doesn't have anything. It's my great-grandfather's name, and that's about all the significance it has.
Well, that's lovely. Peyton is asking more about clothing. Specifically, are there different clothes for different seasons? And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, absolutely. So when you think about just like today, right? So we're going to have clothes that we wear during the spring, during the summer, during the fall, during the winter. It's the exact same thing in the 18th century, right? So with Europeans, it's the same exactly with native folks. So during the summer months at home, you see people pretty much dressing like they would at their leisure. So they're wearing things like breech clouts, wrap skirts, petticoats, shirts, moccasins, as they're just going about the village doing their work of hunting or fishing or taking in crops. But when coming to places like Williamsburg, where it's a capital city, they're coming here for large political functions or celebrations back home during the dances and the get-togethers. That's where you're going to see people put on a lot of their fancy clothes, right? So they're going to put on their nicest shirt. They're going to wear their silver armbands. They're going to wear their fancy moccasins. And then during the winter time, we do have the matched coat that I was wearing, for example, something that's going to be keeping you warm. But you do see other cloaks and capes and jackets and greatcoats being worn as well by native folks because of the European trade. And so a lot of the clothes that we have coming through that trade are going to be finding their way into our different communities too. So the way that you see everybody dressed today and how unique and different everybody's style and clothing is, same thing you'd see in the 18th century.
So I think people always want to be comfortable and show their own fashion, no matter what era you're looking at. I think that's nice. Chris, Lindsay has a question specifically for you. Lindsay would like to know, what are you wearing around your neck?
Oh, so what I'm wearing here is a necklace made by a friend of mine, Walter. He is a Nupiat from Alaska, and what it is actually bear claws, and also this is walrus ivory that the native folks in Alaska are using and selling, and that's mainly their income. So when they're not able to go to certain places, go work at a store or a restaurant or things like that, they're using their artwork as a form of income to subsidize and buy certain things like snowmobiles and stuff like that, so they can go do their more traditional things like whaling and fishing and things like that for the rest of the year. Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Leslie is asking us, why would American Indians have come to Williamsburg in the 1700s? And when they visit and come here, where would they have stayed in Williamsburg?
So it kind of depends on who it is, right? So there are dozens and dozens of different groups that come here to Williamsburg to do business. We can kind of divide them into two larger groups. You have foreign tribes like Cherokees and Catawbas, Shawnees and Creeks and Iroquois, who are considered sovereign and independent. They are not under the king's rule. And so they're going to come here like any other sovereign nation, France or Spain or Portugal, to do business on a nation-to-nation level with the governor. So land disputes, borders, military alliances, trade, economy are all the types of stuff that those folks are discussing. And they may stay in the Raleigh, which is a local tavern, or the King's Arm Tavern, or at the governor's palace if they're small enough. If you come to our encampment site at Colonial Williamsburg, that is a reproduction of a large encampment set up for bigger delegations. A Cherokee delegation numbering about 200 folks comes here. There's nowhere in town for them to stay. And so the governor at the time sets up a military encampment somewhere near Palace Green because it's the cheapest thing to do. You've got the local tribes, on the other hand, who are subjects of the crown, and they're coming and doing business like poor Virginia farmers. So they're here to sell tobacco, to sell produce or oysters or fish, selling rockfish, striped bass to the governor himself. Women are making pottery and baskets. So they're here participating in the local economy just like every other Virginian.
Awesome. And for those of you who haven't visited Colonial Williamsburg and who might not be familiar with the layout of our town, the places Martin just mentioned, like King's Arms Tavern, the Raleigh Tavern, Palace Green, those are all very much in the center of town. So to give you an idea, Indians coming in to visit, they're in the center of everything. Mrs. Randolph's class is watching us in South Carolina today. Thanks for tuning in, guys. And they are asking, can you explain your tattoos?
Yeah, so I've got a couple visible tattoos. So my community, Spalding community, we were tributary tribes of Virginia, and part of the annual tribute was 3 Indian arrows. So I've got that represented here. And then on this arm, I've got my children represented. So my son's name is Hamunti, which is bearskin, so I've got a bear. And then my daughter's name is Nikonha, and that was one of the last fluent speakers from my community. That's actually his Cayuga name. His Tutelo name is Waskite, which is mosquito. So I've got a bear and a mosquito representing my kids.
Very nice. And then I guess I do have one that is I guess what you consider to be a traditional tattoo. And it's one that I wear on my chest right here, and it's you can kind of see it's this cross-looking bit. That right there is a very common tattoo that you see on a lot of speakers from southeastern woodland communities. And usually that's traditionally more so worn on the throat because it represents the cross logs of a council fire. And for that, whenever you see people coming to Williamsburg, right, who are here to meet with the governor, that person is serving as the vessel for the voices of their community, right? So this person wearing a tattoo like that isn't going to come to Williamsburg and say, this is what I think or what I'm going to do or what I want. That speaker is saying, here's what my community wants, here's what my community has said, and here's what their wishes are. And so usually that represents somebody having just simply being the vessel by which their community will speak to foreign nations.
And mine, my tattoos, a lot of them are a little more modern than traditional. So they do have their own meanings, though. I have some tattoos up here on my upper shoulder for people like my wife and my daughter that represent those, have that representation of those folks. And tattooing is just something that's been in Native culture for quite a long time, hundreds and even thousands of years.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing that, you guys. Mrs. Schlossberg's class is watching as well and is asking, what weapons did tribes use for hunting? And we have another question, very similar subject, coming in from San Diego. How often, it's kind of two-part, how often did 18th century American Indians hunt, and today? Do you guys still hunt? Do we see the tribes still hunting? So lots of questions, but what weapons are being used? How often did hunting happen, and how often does hunting happen?
So hunting is one of those things that's still a part of a lot of traditional communities. Within some of our treaty rights, we don't have to respect the idea of seasonality. Like hunting today is where you have deer season and you have bear or turkey or whatever. With some of our treaties, we have the right to go out and subsistently hunt fish, oyster, gather as we need for our own subsistence. So in some areas, people are hunting year-round, and it's a huge part of the providing food and meat and protein for the table. A lot of folks today hunt the way everybody else does, right? So I hunt and I use a shotgun, right? It's because shotgun hunting is super prevalent around here. It's the most common type of hunting, but I've got a modern compound bow if I want to go hunting, or a crossbow if I want to use that. Historically, you're typically talking about bows, in some areas possibly atlatls, which are long spears that use a thrower to increase the distance, or something really common in the southeast are blowguns. So going after squirrels, rabbits, birds up in trees. The largest thing I've ever heard of being taken with a blowgun is a turkey. So using really thin splinters of wood being shot out of typically river cane tubes, or sometimes wood that's been hollowed out and then glued back together. But hunting, yeah, hunting is still absolutely a thing that a lot of our communities still do and still get a lot of enjoyment out of.
Wonderful. Awesome. We have another question coming in relating to clothing. This one's coming to us from San Diego. Is there a significance to the earrings that American Indians wear?
That's a good question. So the earrings, much like tattoos, right, in many instances can also be decorative items, right, for adorning oneself. So when we think of like the modern day, think of all the different ways that people like to adorn themselves, right? So they have different tattoos, they have different hairstyles, piercings, and etc. Again, that's very much a similar thing that you're going to see in the 18th century. So when you think of folks wearing like the silver bobs that you see Martin wearing, or you see the silver punched earrings that you see Chris there wearing, those become very, very popular items for trade in the 18th century of what England knows they can supply to different tribes in exchange for the furs that they're wanting. So we got something that England wants, and England got something that we want. And so a lot of it also has to do with the exchange of fashion. So it looks nice. I don't know how y'all feel about your fancy earrings.
Pretty much the same, yeah.
Awesome. Well, we have another question about fashion and clothing. A class in San Diego is asking us, what do the women wear, and did women's clothing have any special significance?
Yeah, so women's clothing, just like today, and just like we may have, Cody kind of answered earlier, You have work clothing, clothing that is going to be less adorned, that is going to be less intricate for everyday use, whether you're out in the farm field, where you're taking care of kids, repairing your household, or just going about town. And then you have clothes that may be more traditionally heavily embellished with silk or glass beads for large social events or coming here to Williamsburg. And that translates over today, right? You have Native women today who still go out and garden and do work, and they're wearing jeans and dicky pants. And then you've got kind of high-end fashion. B. Yellowtail is a high-end couture Native designer, and she makes clothes that people wear to the red carpet or they wear to political events. And so you have this kind of melding of traditional fashion for men and women with kind of modern sensibility, and that combination of the two has kind of produced its own unique look throughout Indian country.
Awesome. Mrs. Schlossberg's class is written in again, asking what animals Native people lived with in the 18th century.
Oh, that's a very good question. So with animals, when you think about the idea of European farming, right? So much like Martin said, with the introduction of European arrival becomes domesticated animals, so pigs, cows, chickens, and things like that. In a lot of instances, especially here in the eastern woodland regions, the only type of animals that you see working or living with tribes are going to be dogs. But even then, it's not widely done. So for a lot of communities, there is a taboo about a living creature owning another living being. And so that also translates to people owning or keeping animals as property, right? And so the idea of raising livestock doesn't start to develop more so until after European arrival, but after quite some time. So before that, when you asked a question about hunting, that's also very good because hunting makes up a smaller portion of our diet, right? So we're not raising those animals to slaughter and then eat. We're going out and hunting whenever we're looking to provide that meat for our community. But it's because we can't own those animals in that instance.
Well, we have another question coming in from Ms. Schlossberg's class. What do tribes eat on a regular basis? And I know you guys were talking about this right before we started filming today.
We all go ahead.
I was going to say a lot of tribes are farming agriculturalists who are eating squash and beans and corn and things like that. But there's definitely a population of other kind of animals that are here and prevalent in the 18th century. You know, you do have elk and wood bison and things like that the native folks are eating, but the majority of their diet is coming from that farmland that they're farming.
Yeah, right before we started shooting, we all went out and got tacos. So, so just today, Native folks, we eat sushi, we eat tacos, we order pizza, Chinese food. We have access to all the same types of cuisine as anyone else here in the United States. So we do have our own traditional foods. We have our own foods that have become traditional, like fried bread tacos and stuff like that. And then we have access to everything else under the sun that you can get at a grocery store or your local restaurant. So I would say that question highly depends on the time period and who you're talking to, right?
That makes sense. Tying in actually really nicely, talking about traditional foods, what you're eating at different times. Ms. Wise's class is asking, do you have your own holidays? And Ms. Schlossberg's class is following that up with, do you have any favorite traditions? So I think those often in traditional American mindset go hand in hand with food as well. So does food tie into any of that? And beyond that, are there traditions or holidays that are celebrated by tribes in the 18th century and today?
Absolutely. So a lot of our cultural events or our relationship to one another within Native communities is always heavily tied to food and sharing in community. And so in a lot of these big events, that's where you're going to see a lot of these more traditional foods being eaten. So like down in Cherokee, like bean bread and fatback are going to be very popular things. I know out west in my mother's community, there's different types of cornmeals and stuff that we love to eat during festival times with certain types of soups and chilies and things. In one respect, like with a lot of eastern woodland tribes, there's Green Corn Festival, which is a big annual celebration that's held regularly, and it's a event where people can kind of come together and celebrate the ripening of the corn. And then out west, in my mother's community, we have what's known as like a governor's feast. So a governor's feast is basically in honor of the governor, But it's one of the big times where you'll see a lot of outsiders be welcomed in the community, to be invited in to come and eat and watch the dances and things like that. But it's kind of the idea of, if you see a door open, you can walk in, sit down, and then they'll call you up to eat at the table. And so there's nobody who will turn you away if you're looking to eat and dine with folks. So when you think about the connection of food and family and community, that's all very closely tied to one another.
You guys don't have any additional favorite traditions to add?
I can definitely say that in Alaska, a lot of tribes have potlucks, and a potluck is something that's super important, that a lot of people will bring things like fried fish, halibut, salmon, and things like that to. Yeah, that was a really big part of the community up there, was a potluck. And when there was a potluck happening, everybody knew about it. Everybody was coming, and it was a lot of fun. It was really enjoyable.
That
Yes.
sounds wonderful.
So for like my own community, we have some of our traditional practices have morphed into things that are more like socially acceptable within our community today because of like conversion to Christianity. But like one of my favorite events, and we haven't been able to do it for a little while now because of world events going on, is our chili cook. And that's, everybody getting together and cooking chili and sharing that chili and just having a big kind of community, like Cody said, around food. All of our community events surround food. There's not one community event that I can go to where there isn't some level of food, whether that's traditional food, whether that's modern food, whether that's somewhere in the middle, of offering both. But food plays a central role, like I think it does around the world in events and celebrations, yeah.
It's one of those wonderful universal things. Everyone gathers around
Absolutely.
food. That's great. Mrs. Curry is asking, is there a certain animal that is sacred?
I think that's going to depend on your community, right? So I think one of the biggest misunderstandings most modern Americans have is they view all Native people as this monolithic culture, like we're just different small groups of the same people. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Myself, I'm Saponi, Cody is Pueblo. We're two completely different countries. We're as different as Germany is from Japan or Italy or France. And so our cosmology, our religious belief, how we view the world is going to be drastically different from each other. And so what may be important or sacred or anything like that in my community may not mean anything to folks from Cody's community. So yeah, you will find things that each individual community has maybe reverence for or has more importance. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a number of questions coming in about what children and young people are doing, both for work, for fun, for entertainment, for all of that. I know Caleb has written in with a great question, as well as Katie and Yosi. So Caleb from Ms. Y's class is asking, what did the children do to entertain themselves? But then the other side of things, Yosi's asking, what did children do from work, writing in from Mr. Woodward's class. And Katie, also from Mr. Woodward's class, is asking, at what age did children start hunting? So let's talk a little bit more about childhood for both 18th century American Indians and modern day.
That's a very good question. So when you think about children in different American Indian communities in the 18th century, it's much like Martin said, right? With these communities being very different and diverse from one another, the children in their daily lives are going to be very different, right? So when you think about Cherokee folks, for instance, in the historical period, where they are not considered to be products of their parents, they are their own autonomous individuals. They're considered like miniature adults, right? So children have their own curiosities, their own skills, their own interests that may be very different from the parents. And so your mother, most notably, is going to be the one who's educating you to be a good, proper, upstanding citizen of that society. Not by telling you what to do, but providing you options. And so in a lot of instances, your mother is there to provide you, or to provide you with warmth, clothing, food, but also to advise you in your proper path, right? What you need, what you want, and what your concerns are. And so in many instances, children are given a lot of autonomy to kind of explore their own reality, right? So things like being taken to council and participating in government from a very young age is very prevalent. Going hunting from a young age, going to war for a young age. Young women taking over responsibilities within the household, like making the fire, tending to the fields, gathering water, and anything like that. And so there's a large diversity and array of things that children could participate in as equal members of the society. But again, it is going to depend on the tribe as to how their children are raised or taken care of. So what you might do for fun, you got play games. There's games that we have that are usually educational, like Chunky helps folks for hunting. There's Beans, which helps children learn how to count, right? And then stories, of course, listening to how we think the world is, or how we treat one another, or how we look at ourselves, or anybody else. Those stories are going to be part of a life and the upbringing. Those games are going to be part of the life and the upbringing of the children. Yeah, so that's what about some Cherokee kids are going to be raised.
And so in a lot of our societies, you have the same type of toys. You have dolls. You have kind of think of kids today. You get them miniature tool sets, miniature kitchens, and so a lot of it is learning through play, and that's not going to be any different today or historically. So you'll have young girls who have dolls, and they're learning to make clothes that fit those dolls, and then that kind of transitions over into now you can make adult-sized clothes. You understand the process of measuring and cutting and sewing and all those things. Like Cody said, you have young boys playing chunky. When they get older, they may start playing the ball game, whether that's stickball down here in the southeast or more lacrosse-style ball up north. And then that game is, one, it's a game, but two, it's also a way of handling difficult political decisions, things that we may not want to go to war over or may have taboos against going to war over. Sometimes are decided through ball games with other communities. So I'm going to get all my best players. You're going to get your best players. We're going to play to 50, 60, however many points we set out. And whoever wins that argument, wins that disagreement. So some of these things that kids are doing have real impact. Cody hinted on another good one is taking kids to council. In a lot of our societies, kids have responsibility, whether that's they can voice their opinion or vote, but they have some influence on politics. They are citizens of our nation. And so taking kids from a very young age, teaching them how to speak, how to be concise, how to be orators, is going to be an important part of what kids are doing kind of growing up.
And I would like to say, kind of chime in on the more modern stuff. Obviously, kids are playing with more modern dolls and modern toys, whether they be battery operated or board games and things like that, video games, you know. They're playing that kind of stuff just like anyone else. But they also do enjoy when they do things like they dance to modern music. But they also like to learn and dance and enjoy native music as well. So it all ties in together, and it's very important that they're learning those things, but they're also having fun. So it's very enjoyable for them.
That's awesome. Well, Cody, I know that you had mentioned storytelling as one thing that's enjoyed, and Mrs. Layton's class has asked about storytelling. Specifically, what is your favorite American Indian story?
My favorite American Indian story. So there is one story that my brother tells, and it's called Following Directions. I think it's a very wonderful story that really talks about the idea of how you treat people, right? Of the values of what you want to instill in yourself and in others, right? To create a better working community. And that's really what a lot of our stories are based on. Stories are made to teach you how not to do something. That if you did do something, how do we correct that behavior? How do we treat other people, right? So all of that is going to be contained within those stories. And so in a lot of ways, when you think about American Indian people from the past to the present, there are a lot of correlations in that way, because a lot of those stories that we have today have been shared from the historical period. So when we talk about using resources like documents and things from the past, we still have a lot of those stories from there in ourselves, right? So we can go to these different American Indian communities and learn a lot about their culture and their history and their identity by listening to their stories, as long as we're willing to sit down and open our ears, right?
Martin and Chris, did you guys have any favorite stories that you wanted to add to the mix?
So I wouldn't say it's a story, but he's one of my favorite characters from kind of my community and some shared communities down here in the Southeast. You've got the Great Hare, this kind of hero trickster, and he does everything from, in some communities, creating humanity to slaying of these kind of monstrous creatures. And so he uses his wit, his intellect, but also physical prowess in kind of equal parts to become successful. And I think that's, like Cody said, there's lessons to teach kids in that there are times where you can use your physical means to solve problems or disagreements, but it's also equally as resourceful and equally as productive to use your mind, your intellect, your wit, your ability to speak to do those same things. And so I think it's kind of a mirror on balancing society. You know, not everything has to be physical. There is that component where you can talk a disagreement out and stuff like that.
I think one of my favorite stories is actually a little more of a modern one by a native poet, and it kind of discusses the story of the wolf and how people understand the wolf and come to fear it and feel like it's dangerous and things like that. And so he ends up in a cage and in zoos and things like that, and that's how they understand him, as being dangerous, when really they're not, after anybody. They have their own way and lifestyle and things like that. And so the correlation between the story of the wolf and being in a cage is tied into quite a bit about how people see native folks, right?
Well, thank you guys for sharing that. Unfortunately, we are running low on time. So before we go, one last question. Is there a big myth or misconception about Native people that you all want to address?
Sure. So one of the big misconceptions that I usually like to address is the idea that Native people are just simply relegated to the past, right? So usually when we talk about these things in the modern day, it's usually where were the Indians? What did they do? Where did they live? What did they eat? But we never really get into this fun conversation of the modern day of where are we now? What do we like to eat? What do we like to do in the modern day? So right here you have three modern Native people that kind of shows you that a lot of these communities are still around in the contemporary day, except we just live and work like anybody else does. So I come in, I clock in at the beginning of the day, I do my job, I clock out. I like to go home, play some video games, watch some movie or TVs and things like that. And so it's fun to have that conversation to see Indian people in the modern day, right? Living as modern people.
I think a common myth I run into is a lot of folks thinking that Native people are always so serious and very stoic in a lot of the pictures and things like that. But we definitely like to joke around and have a lot of fun. And it's really hard to actually get Cody, but when you do, it's worth it. That's for sure.
Yeah. For me, it's kind of that idea that we're all the same, right? For most folks, when they think of Indian folks, they're thinking of like John Wayne and Clint Eastwood and teepees and hunting buffalo. And one, except for some uncontacted tribes in the Amazon, no one's living like that anymore. We all have snowmobiles or cars, electricity. We all have access to a lot of the same modern conveniences that everybody else does. But even historically, most of us never lived like that. Most of us were sedentary agriculturalists, much like in Europe, right? You've got farm fields that's providing 70-80% of your food. You've got a permanent town where you're going to grow up, likely live most of your life. Maybe you'll move somewhere else if you marry. But that's really going to be about it. But everybody thinks of Indians as these folks that are always nomadic, that are always chasing buffalo. And that's some of the questions we get from kids today, like how'd you get to work? Did you take a horse? Do you live here? Are these your normal clothes? And so again, like Cody kind of iterated, is people view us as like figments of the past and not really modern folks with modern tastes and stuff like that.
Well, thank you guys for explaining all that to us, enlightening us. I think we all got to learn a lot today. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us for our very first episode of CW Kids Ask, and for sending us so many awesome questions. We encourage you to find out more about tribes in your own area. Martin, what's the best way for all the students watching to learn more about their local tribes?
So there's a couple ways they can go about it. So looking at like your state websites, you'll typically, a lot of those have a list of the tribes that reside within the state. You also have the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and that's under the Department of the Interior. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs oversees the interactions between the federal government and tribes. On their website, they have a list of all the federally recognized tribes, and so you can go there and search the tribes that are in your area and then go to their website, learn about their culture, their history, and maybe even find some events that you can go and visit and speak to these people in person about.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, and thank you all three of you, Martin, Chris, and Cody, for joining us today. Don't forget to watch our next episode on October 27th when we'll talk all about the colonial economy. Have a great day!